lecturers of the UTG and the MDI. Thank you, the organizers and the students of this institution, for giving me the opportunity to come and address you uh, about a very important topic, the issue of the United Nations.
ESSA by Faal, mi yalon ko atelebe lead council yala Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission mi yalon ko alota Gambia banko kan purka Yahya Abdul Aziz James Jonkun Jamme Babili Mansa ay kuwal mulke Gambia banko kan ala nyaton kaya koto kabo 1994 kata fo 2016. ESSA by Faal yatele invite University of the Gambia purka karamunta dinneol karandi ke londi kuwala mi yalon ko lebe dendinga United Nation na kuola dunia kono. United Nation na alota munala dunia kono ikamun kule tamandi dunia kono. ESSA by Faal awole sayin kan karamunda dinewle mu yalon ko wolle be siring nyindulato. I'll stay connected with Active TV nganao kibaro bondali nyoto.
The pride we take in our brand, the work we put in to constantly change the landscape and elevate real estate in the Gambia, it's compared to none. From inception, our goal was to add value to the beautiful Gambian landscape. That's why we are proud innovators of community estates. Kololi Sands is an exceptional piece of work, tailored for ultimate convenience and luxury, to bring you an element of finesse that is rare but unique in its own. This is also our pride and joy, and we welcome you to the exquisite beauty right here in Kololi and right here on the waterfront. Kololi Sands, feel the ocean breeze at your doorstep.
Ramadan, Ash-Shahru, Ramadan, the month of peace is here, and I wish you well.
Promotion. Send or receive your items through French Touch and get one of the following items: rice, sugar, onion, oil, and many important items that one can need in the month of Ramadan. Mbadi wolo French Touch wole nyim promotion kudima natale nang iko nyin karo horomare umi yalon ko ikafa ko sun karo French Touch ko bakaso kaki Italia andum fanan kela bakaso ta Italia. French Touch ko imari isa fen sotono jele mumboko mano tulo jabo aning feng koten mu yalon ko sunkaro kono molka sulela French Touch komi albe yalo nyame itel ka kontena la ki kamola joral bonde tubabu du kasambe Gambia banko kan ni be Gambia banko kan fanan ise fen soto no jele fen kendol mi yalon ko na bunko no joral aning feng koten mi yalon ko na haramadiya ko non titano mansula wo fen la French Touch na tate la manga sando albo fen soto la jele French Touch ko ni la bakaso ki waranto tate la bakaso taje waranto tata bakaso sanje ibe fendile la mi yalon ko abe mari kontanin la kendeke tulo bo kono jabo bo kono mano ba kono tamareli bije anim fen koten mi yalon ko nka sulela na dunia balu kono soko sunkaro kono French Touch ali kacha nyoya atel mi yalon ko albe Gambia banko kanga ali kacha nyoya plus 220315238 waranto ila headquarters mi yalon ko ila bumba mi yalon ko abe France banko kanga plus 336594 French Touch itele nata purka baluo sone andi Gambia dingul be
Ramadan, Ash-Shahru, Ramadan, the month of peace is here, and I wish you well.
Hello, wonderful viewers, wonderful subscribers. This is Active TV again for another fast and a quick update. Mbadi ulu, mbalbe kontona, mbalbe jiala, mbalbe bismillah la kotake. Active TV purkana kibaro bonde nan kotake mi yalon ko akabo Gambia banko kanga. The lead council of Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission, ESSA by Faal, was invited at the University of the Gambia as the guest lecturer to deliver historic public lectures on the United Nations in post-conflict recovery. Mbadiwolu ESSA Mbay Faal mi yalonko atelebe nyatonga ke kan lead council of truth, reconciliation and reparation commission ka kiskisirol ke former president Yahya Jammeh kol mu yalonko anala mansa kunda yo la tamandi kabo 1994 kadaba 2016 ESSA Mbay Faal yatele kera bunya ka samba University of the Gambia pour ka karamunta dinewol karandi kol la mu yalonko wolebe dendinga United Nations na tamandiri nyalla United Nations lota wati jumale alon kan kumunati ikamun kulle tamandi dunia kono ESSA Mbay Faal awla sayin kan karambunto dinnewol albe lamu hakilola mbe video nyim plela lecture mi yalon ko ESSA Mbay Faal yake University of the Gambia MDI student ol bije University student ol bije kula mi yalon ka kumata kendeke.
Thank you, the organizers and the students of this institution, for giving me the opportunity to come and address you about a very important topic, the issue of the United Nations and post-conflict recovery. Why is it interesting for me is that I am given the opportunity to share my experiences with you on something that really affects humanity at large. I had the great fortune to work at the United Nations Security Council, where I participated at various levels in the negotiation, in the crafting of resolutions that would eventually lead to the deployment of United Nations peacekeeping troops around the world. I have had first-hand experience of some of the considerations that underlined some of these decisions. I have also worked in East Timor, where I had the good fortune to be a United Nations staff with a very unique mandate, that is a transitional administration mandate, wherein the UN was essentially the government of the new country that was born in 1999. And the UN being the government, we had to build institutions from scratch. That was a very interesting experience because it exposed us to post-conflict peace building. It exposed us to recovery of a country from the brink of war. I have also worked with the International Development Law Organization based in Rome, where I had to travel around the world to design and implement justice sector reform programs to help countries that are emerging out of conflict, in particular in Liberia and in Afghanistan. I have also worked at the International Criminal Court, at the Office of the Prosecutor, where we had to take certain interventions that affected countries that were in conflict or emerging out of conflict. And that is the justice end of things, like investigating and prosecuting human rights violations. I have also worked as a defense counsel at the ICC, where I have experienced firsthand the impact of the decisions that are made with regards to those countries or some of these countries that are emerging out of conflict. I, however, must admit that this topic is very broad. It is it's a giant topic, and I think my experiences are so limited to do justice to it. But I would share it nonetheless. I would share my experiences nonetheless. But I just want to cancel this institution, to look to Dr. Cisse, Dr. Lamin Cisse of the TRRC, the chairman, who's had almost 50 years of experience working in this field at the United Nations and working at the office of the Secretary General. Being the person who was always next to the Secretary General, he certainly had much more experience than I possibly could ever have. And he would have been the ideal person for this topic. But nonetheless, invite him someday and let him give you grandfather stories about the experiences he has had. Some of the things that you would never find written in any book. And I think that would enrich your appreciation of diplomacy. He certainly has into his fingertips all the intricacies that are involved, all the crazy things that go on behind the scenes when things are negotiated. And I'm sure that with his presence here, your knowledge of that topic would certainly be enriched. But that said, I would still thank the organizers for thinking me worthy to deliver such a lecture. Conflict, in particular an armed conflict, has bedeviled the world since time immemorial. Mankind had always looked for ways to deal with prevention or management of conflict, or the restoration of peace and consolidation of peace gains and post conflict recovery. The very history of the United Nations typifies this quest by mankind to deal with the problem of managing and ending armed conflicts and ensuring durable post conflict recovery. After World War I, an international group brought about the League of Nations to address disputes between nations. The initiative failed. Undeterred, after World War II, an international organization came together to promote international peace. This culminated on 25th April 1945 at a conference in San Francisco, the United States, in which the outlines of what would eventually be the United Nations Charter were hammered out. And in October of 1945, 51 states ratified the United Nations Charter, and hence the United Nations was born. And it was born as a global diplomatic and political organization dedicated to international peace and stability and to avoid abuses of war. At the outset, the UN had only 51 signatories to the Charter. Today, the United Nations has 193 members. And the major initiatives of the United Nations include preventing conflict by exploring options to ensure peace, providing food and medical assistance in emergencies, and offering humanitarian support to millions of people around the world. Even though the UN is sometimes criticized for its policies, bureaucracy, and spending, the organization has accomplished hundreds of successful peacekeeping missions. In its website, the UN described its functions as four main functions or four main goals. One is to maintain international peace and security. Two is to develop friendly relations amongst nations. Three is to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems. And four, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. In a sense, the purpose of the United Nations is to save existing generations from the scourge of war. This is a very lofty challenge, to save existing generations from the scourge of war. Meeting this challenge can be a daunting task. However, this is the only barometer, this is the only yardstick by which we can judge the successes of the United Nations. We cannot talk about post conflict recovery without, first of all, achieving peace. I therefore postulate that the success of economic recovery, or recovery for that matter, general recovery, for any state, will to a large or considerable extent depend on how peaceful the environment is. Fragile peace does not bode well for easy and quick recovery. And the UN has very limited tools to ensure restoration of peace in conflict zones. You may all know this, but UN peacekeeping intervention takes mainly two forms. One is a Chapter 6 intervention, and the other is a Chapter 7 intervention, as they would call it. Uh, Chapter 6 deals with the Pacific settlement of disputes, and it involves the sending of observer missions, deployment of envoys, the use of good offices, and so forth. That is the diplomacy bit about it. And Chapter 7 deals with the enforcement powers of the United Nations Security Council, and which is basically tasked with the responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And those powers include the power to impose sanctions, the power to take such actions by air, land, sea forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. That is actually the awesome power of the United Nations. They can mobilize forces and attack a country or a place in the name of maintenance of international peace and security under the mandate of the United Nations Security Council. That is real awesome power. But this power of the United Nations was rather constricted or stifled, if I may, during the Cold War. I am sure most of you would know the Cold War. That was the basically silent war between USSR and the United States. And that Cold War significantly hampered the ability of the UN to achieve its greatest potential in the maintenance of international peace and security. It basically paralyzed the UN, it paralyzed the Security Council, it paralyzed the UN. So, how did the UN Security Council respond? They just did the simple things that they could do. And why was it the case that the Cold War actually paralyzed the United Nations or the Security Council for that matter? You had two countries, USSR, Soviet Union, and then you have the United States. They could hardly agree on anything. And the Security Council, the architecture of the Security Council is that 5 member states have veto powers. If they vote against a decision, that decision collapses. But you have the US here and the USSR, on the other hand, they could hardly agree on anything. So you see, UN intervention was difficult to obtain. So what the Security Council could do was to limit itself to the simple things that they could do to help achieve international peace and security, like negotiating ceasefire agreements between belligerent parties, stabilizing violence, and using diplomatic means to arrive at solutions. But of course, that was not really a solution to the problem. So then you had protracted conflicts going on around the world, and there were no solutions. So the UN became a talking shop, and the Security Council was a toothless bulldog because it could not bite. But this was hardly a situation that really benefited mankind. But the Cold War ended in the early 90s. The situation started to change. I arrived at the United Nations on 1st January 1998. And what I found there was hardly satisfactory. As a young diplomat and as the legal advisor to the Gambia Permanent Mission, which was elected to the Security Council, we were faced with this situation that we were representing West Africa in the UN Security Council, and we had to push the position and views and aspirations of the West African delegations that are in the United Nations. But more importantly, we had to serve the ideals of the United Nations. And here we are, still trapped in the mindset of the Cold War, still trapped in the polarization of various blocs and rivalries between various countries. The Security Council could not do as much as it should have been able to do. And I give you a few examples. The United Nations deployed forces to Yugoslavia because there was the war in Yugoslavia. Bosnia's and Serbia and all those wars that were going on. But in order to deploy a United Nations missions, they had to negotiate a mandate for the mission, that this is what you are tasked to do. And this is the authority under which you are to do it. So if you're given a Chapter 6 mandate, it means you cannot use force. You would have your guns and everything, but you cannot even shoot. How is that helpful to anybody? Sometimes you are given a mandate, but the language of the mandate is so watered down that at the end of the day it becomes meaningless. It's not fit for purpose. Or there is so much ambiguity deliberately built into it just to satisfy the wishes of the various delegations, to the extent that at the end of the day, when it comes to implementation, there isn't much you can do. And I'll give you a few examples of in which I was involved in. But let's first talk about Srebrenica. Srebrenica was attacked. This was a UN safe zone being guarded by the Dutch contingent, a military outfit, military contingent from the Netherlands. They were given the task to protect the people who were there. But they did not have the mandate to fight. And what happened? The zone was overrun and 350 people were massacred. In the face of the United Nations. There they were standing and watching. People being massacred. But this was not the only place such a thing has happened. If you look at Rwanda, in 100 days, over 800,000 people were killed, and the United Nations were there. They could not do anything. Why could they not do anything? Because they did not have the mandate to fight. It was after these events that the United Nations said it would no longer allow evil such as those that had happened in these places to be perpetrated, and the United Nations would sit back and not do anything. And that was the genesis or the beginning of the concept of humanitarian intervention. But this is very important. Just imagine the United Nations is standing by with their guns and tanks and everything, and they allowed a ragtag of forces to just come overrun the place and take and kill people. And I will tell you one from my own experience. 2 weeks after I arrived at the UN Security Council, I attended a meeting on Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone definitely is the constituency that I represented, because we were representing West Africa. It's the region that we represented. And fortunately, I went to university in Sierra Leone and I understood the place. The war started in my presence. I at least had some little idea about the war, because in campus we would sit there and rebels would wander into campus. So we would see them, we would interact with them. I knew at the time that a lot of the rebels were always high on drugs. And a lot of them, there were children bearing arms. So I knew this fact. So when I attended the first meeting drafting this resolution, they came up with what is called a chapter 6.5 resolution. It is a little more than chapter 6, but it is not an enforcement power as you would have in chapter 7. So they call it the Chinese formula. How did it become the Chinese formula? It is as a result of compromise, because they never could agree on anything. The ideal would be chapter 7. Russia and China would never accept chapter 7, but the rest of the world would not accept chapter 6 because it's weak. So what do you have? They struck a compromise to come up with something called chapter 6.5. So it's just your basic right of self-defense, which is also a right in chapter 6, so it's meaningless. So in that negotiation, they said, well, we can only go with a chapter 6.5 resolution for Sierra Leone. I kept laughing. And I recall a British delegate asked me, what is funny? I said, I know this would fail. And then I was swiftly and quickly brushed aside. This is the new guy at the Security Council. Who is he telling us that this is going to fail? So, of course, Gambia being a small country in the world, what powers does it have in the Security Council? So our objections were quickly mooted and the resolution passed. And then quickly the Secretary General deployed Indian troops to Sierra Leone. And few days after they arrived, they were all rounded up and captured by 15-year-olds carrying AK-47s. Such an embarrassment to the United Nations. Just imagine 15-year-olds rounded up the Indian contingent. And the UN had to resort to going to negotiate to free those people. it was a travesty. It could have led to disaster because a lot of those kids were high on drugs. And you know, in some of these rebel groups, command and control can be very loose. They are not trained soldiers. They are not under a very disciplined and regimented force. So therefore, they can act ruthlessly and outside the rules of armed conflict. So this is just one crazy example of what happened. So quickly, we had to change. But we only changed after a terrible embarrassment. Another example is the UN biases, because these things are always a product of negotiation. Say, we from the Gambia, we were very concerned about what was happening in Guinea-Bissau. Because there was a terrible war going on behind at our backyard in Guinea-Bissau. We wanted something done about Guinea-Bissau. There was no political will, there was no appetite at the United Nations Security Council to do anything about it. And therefore, the war in Guinea-Bissau continued. Drugs, it became a haven for drugs, and that also affected our countries. But because the UN, it's difficult to hammer out agreements on anything, nothing could be done about Guinea-Bissau. Now, let's talk about Kosovo, for instance. In 1999, I think at this time, Gambia was also president of the Security Council. So it meant that every problem concerning international armed conflict or interstate conflict, it will come to us. So, very heavy responsibility being president of the Security Council, because you coordinate the activities of the Security Council. We have worked on a resolution for Yugoslavia, for the protection of Kosovo. No agreement could be reached. And the US became so frustrated. You sit at the Security Council table, round table, discussing these things, and you could feel the tension in the room. You could feel the tension that things are not well. Sometimes even diplomats can hit the table, just to show frustration. Everything was done, nothing. And suddenly the US said if nothing was done, they were going to do the unthinkable. They were going to attack. And then they started bandying around the phrase humanitarian intervention, we are going to do it. And one day, we just woke up, I think it was 24th of March, and we saw the bombs were dropping in Kosovo. And then the telephone started ringing, Security Council meeting. Look, it was frantic. Instantly, there was an emergency informal meeting of the council and a formal meeting of the Security Council. I think it was a Sunday. Something like that. This just shows some of the problems that the United Nations has to deal with in its interventions. And in Kosovo, the US organized NATO, that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and then they attacked. That brought about the end to some of the problems that were happening there. I'll give you another very difficult example. You remember Iraq. Iraq was attacked in 1991 because Iraq was believed to have been in violations of certain UN conventions by proliferating nuclear materials and also stockpiling biological and chemical weapons. So in 1991, the first Gulf War, because Iraq attacked Kuwait to annex it, so the US and NATO, well, I think it was on the Security Council, but they attacked to liberate Kuwait. But then they came up with sanctions against Iraq and started a disarmament of Iraq. But in so doing, they had to control all the resources of Iraq. So for Iraq to eat anything, it had to get the approval of the UN Security Council to buy that thing. That was the oil for food program. So the entire resources of Iraq were now being controlled by the United Nations. It's like telling this country, you know what? We don't trust you. We don't trust that if you have money in your pocket, you're not going to buy a gun and bullets and start killing everybody. So we'll control your money. And we'll also check everywhere to see that you don't have weapons. Is that a good place to be in? Well, that is what happened to Iraq. I could recall having meetings with Tariq Aziz, who was the then Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq. And when he described how it felt to them, you could feel the pain that the Iraqis were going through, how they were being raped or stripped of their sovereignty. Terrible situation. You know, for Iraqis to even buy makeup for their women, they had to apply to the 911 committee. And then we had to sit there and decide whether Iraqi women should wear makeup or should not wear makeup. So we decide to approve or not to approve. That is how bad it was. I mean, I participated in the technical committee. So all the applications would come. So we would vet the applications. No, this is not necessary for Iraq. This is necessary. Can you imagine? But that is also shows the awesome power of the United Nations. But it also shows the dysfunctionality of the organization at that time simply because of disagreements between various countries, especially the permanent members of the UN Security Council. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, because as at this time, they could talk to one another. As at this time, the Cold War had ended. I even had occasionally joined Ambassador Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov. He is now foreign minister of Russia, and the then UN ambassador. Over cigarettes and cigars, you sit around the corners and have a puff. So now the US ambassador, or the US permanent representative, and the Russian permanent representative can enjoy coffee and cigar and talk and laugh, you know, unlike the previous times when they looked almost at dagger's end all the time. So as at the time I was there, things were a bit better. But just imagine the situation I have described. It was dismal. It was disappointing. But that was the nature of things. So by the late 90s, the Cold War had ended. The UN Security Council enjoyed greater flexibility and cooperation among its members, which really created a boon for the UN in the sense that the United Nations could now engage in a range of activities and mandates for peacekeeping operations, which previously would be unthinkable. Peacekeepers are now called upon not just to help bring about peace and to maintain it, but also to help build government institutions, promote human rights, and set up police forces, do justice sector reform, and carry out disarmament and demobilization programs. But the political rivalries, the political reality, and the differences in approach and values constantly hampered UN peacekeeping interventions. As a result, even though things have changed significantly, the UN remains to be less effective than it could, and therefore it was open to the criticisms that it fails in the situations where it is entrusted with responsibility to maintain international peace and security, or that it is too weak to deal with violence, or that it often interferes with national sovereignty. So the success rate of the UN at this time was not good at all. Wasn't good at all. But the 1990s still created some new hope for people that the UN would be able to deliver on its mandate. But this 1990s also brought in a terrible situation. That's when you had a lot of intrastate conflict, that is civil wars. You had a lot of violent civil wars. You had Sierra Leone, you had Liberia just in our area, and then you also have Guinea-Bissau, and to a lesser extent Senegal, that is Casamance. But you cannot even discuss Casamance at the Security Council because France would not let anybody discuss it. Because France also has a veto power. So you see the problems. But these civil wars were often long and brutal, and they continue to harm societies long after ceasefires have been reached. And countries emerging out of these conflicts, they face significant challenges with respect to maintaining peace and ensuring development. The United Nations still continue to be in the forefront to help states recover economically from these devastating conflicts and help build durable and lasting peace. And in some areas, they have succeeded significantly. And I'll give you a few examples. East Timor, I participated in writing the resolution that sent the United Nations to East Timor. There was a war. Well, East Timor was given the opportunity by Indonesia to do a referendum to decide whether it wanted to remain as part of Indonesia or would become an independent state. And the East Timorese overwhelmingly voted for independence in a referendum that was organized and supervised by the United Nations. The Indonesian-backed militia ransacked East Timor, attacked and killed a lot of people, and basically destroyed the whole country by way of bombing. They basically burnt the whole country down. So the United Nations organized a UN mission to go and rescue East Timor from the ashes of that war. And I had the good fortune to be amongst those who were deployed to go and help. But even before I left, I participated in ensuring that Gambian police and military officers and even civilians were also deployed to East Timor to help. So when the UN arrived, there was no government. So the UN was tasked, it was UNTAD, the United Nations Transitional Administration for East Timor. It was tasked to now create and build a government from scratch. It meant we have to build all the institutions. You have to create a police force. You have to create a judiciary. You have to create a justice sector. You have to create prisons. You have to create Ministry of Health, Agriculture, and all the necessary institutions you would find in a democratic country. The fact that the UN was able to deploy a transitional administration to East Timor by itself was a huge achievement because really, for the council at the time to agree such a huge enterprise was really surprising, pleasantly. But there you have it. We went to East Timor, we wrote laws, we created institutions, we trained people, and after 2 years, the UN was able to transfer the whole government to the East Timorese. The UN now took a back seat to become advisors and support staff to the East Timorese as they chart their way to recovery. That is one brilliant, successful story of recovery that the UN has organized and executed. There are also some other examples. Liberia, to a lesser extent, the UN assisted in many fronts, and Liberia was able to emerge out of conflict and has recovered. But Sierra Leone, for instance, Sierra Leone went through a 10-year war in which thousands and thousands of people were killed, thousands or hundreds amputated. With the assistance of ECOMOG, with the assistance of the AU and the United Nations, they were able to restore peace in that country and help the country through recovery. Even Darfur, to a lesser extent. When I went to the ICC, I was recruited mainly to guide the Darfur investigations, to lead the Darfur investigations, and later to lead the Darfur prosecutions. And in Darfur, the Sudanese government killed 350,000 black Africans. 350,000 black Africans. At the time, the United Nations described this as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And with various interventions, African Union and the United Nations, they were able to stabilize the situation and peace has been restored. And up to today, you have Gambian peacekeepers in Darfur. So these are good examples of United Nations interventions that have helped recover. Even in Kenya, you remember in 2007, there was post-election violence in Kenya. Okay, it was quelled by Kenyans, but at least the United Nations came in to assist in the recovery process. And that included the justice intervention angle of these recovery processes. Because the recovery process is not just economic, it entails transitional justice, it entails reconciliation and all that, and the United Nations is more suited to help in those things. So for Kenya, those who were believed to have been responsible for the violence were prosecuted. I had the good fortune or the misfortune, as you may say, to defend them. So we defended them successfully, which meant that the wrong people were prosecuted, in my view. But this is the system working very well. And all this happened as a result of United Nations assistance. Is anybody here who can remember the envelope that was given to the ICC prosecutor by Kofi Annan and Lamin Sise? Our own Lamin Sise? That was the envelope that contained the names of the Kenyans that should be prosecuted. So fortunately for us, we were able to defend them successfully. But UN intervention in the maintenance of peace and security and ensuring recovery has witnessed significant failures. The record is not very good at all. I mean, I have mentioned some significant successes, but the record is not very good. But it is important to show that the United Nations has a very important vision of extending a strong helping hand to a community, country, or region to avert conflict or to end violence. They always aspire to ensure that when they leave a mission, the people of the country have the opportunity to do for themselves what they could not do before, to build and hold on to peace, to find reconciliation, to strengthen democracy, and to secure human rights. And these are really the tangibles of any recovery. In a sense, the ideal is to have a United Nations that has not only the will, but also the ability to fulfill the great promise of the United Nations and to justify the confidence and trust placed in it by the overwhelming majority of humankind. Over the years, the UN has struggled to meet these lofty objectives, but it has made significant efforts to reform and reshape itself to deliver on the expectations of humankind. One of those efforts that I personally experienced is the work of the Brahimi panel. Uh, Ambassador Lahda Brahimi was former foreign minister of, Algeria. In early 2000, Secretary General Kofi Annan set up a panel headed by Lahda Brahimi and comprised of people with extensive experience in diplomacy to help reshape the United Nations and so that they would examine the existing system, assess its shortcomings, and make frank, specific, and realistic recommendations for change. Their recommendations focused not only on political change, but also on the strategy, operations, and organizational structure of the United Nations. That panel made profound and or recommended profound and groundbreaking changes for the United Nations. The panel noted, however, that without renewed commitment on the part of member states and significant institutional change and increased financial support, the United Nations will never be capable of executing the critical peacekeeping and peace-building tasks that member states have assigned to it. But in order for the panel, in order for them to be able to deliver, far-reaching changes were to be made. While in East Timor, we saw that the United Nations really made a significant effort at changing the organization. Fully integrated missions were now being deployed, and that helped produce better results. Up to this day, the UN is reforming itself. It has created a peace building support office, the PBSO, and that is helping a lot of countries in their recovery process. The Gambia is a classic example. Post Jame, the Gambia embarked on a transitional justice program in order to transition from dictatorship to a full democracy, in order to transform from a rule by one man to a rule by law. We could not do that without the assistance of the UN Peacebuilding Support Office and the UNDP. So the TRRC that we have today came about as a result of that support. So you see, the UN is changing. It's constantly becoming innovative in finding solutions that would help countries in their recovery process. So they're retooling and they are rekitting. In fact, the current Secretary General has advocated a very holistic approach to UN interventions. In so doing, he has strengthened ties with regional organizations and international financial institutions. And this is a very important one. I remember in 1999, the Gambian delegation at the United Nations Security Council had to embark on a project to help the United Nations and regional organizations forge a stronger partnership. And the Gambia had to sponsor a resolution, really, that helped foster greater cooperation and coordination between the United Nations and regional organizations. And that is what led to the creation of the AU-UN Liaison Office now in Addis. And that was as a result of laudable Gambian efforts. And such efforts still continue. The current Secretary General has established stronger ties between mainstream United Nations, that is the UN Secretariat, and even the financial institutions, so that they can all join forces to help assist in countries' recovery. And when I talk about UN intervention in post-conflict recovery, we're not only talking about the United Nations Security Council or the United Nations Secretariat. We are talking about the entire United Nations system, which comprises of the United Nations Secretariat and the United Nations agencies, that is UNDP, UNICEF, WHO, and others, and also the Bretton Woods institutions. But now, one would add the ICC. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, is not part of the United Nations, right? But it is a sister organization, all aimed at serving mankind, as ensuring a better life and condition for mankind. So these organizations should all work in tandem to ensure that the greater good is provided for mankind. So while the UN is not perfect, it is constantly looking for solutions to its architecture to be more able to effectively respond to the problems of the world. The UN needs the support of all of us, but also the support and political will of governments to ensure that the United Nations is assisted to be able to deliver on the wishes and aspirations of mankind. On that note, I thank you very much. If there are questions, as I expect there would be, perhaps I should just answer them sitting down, if you don't mind. Thank you very much.